Do you have books that you're almost embarrassed to admit that you really like? Has one of your favorite fantasy series been canceled? Let's talk about guilty pleasure reads today, my friends. Welcome to Fantasy for the Ages, the show where a father and son talk about fantasy, science fiction, and other nerdy things we like. Today, guilty pleasures with just Jim, the father of this show. You know, there's respectable quality literature. And then there's the stuff that you enjoy the heck out of that you can't justify. You just like reading it. Quality literature and what you love sometimes just does not coincide. I'm here today to give you permission to like what works for you. And I'm going to share my top 7 guilty pleasure reads. The books from science fiction and fantasy that I enjoy and honestly don't care the heck what anyone else thinks. Okay, that's a little harsh. I do care, but not enough to stop enjoying these books. And you shouldn't either. It's perfectly all right to love reading some things that others may believe is trash, even when they do have justification for those beliefs. That's why we have the term guilty pleasure. We can use it boldly, saying basically, yeah, we know there's issues with these books. But what can we say? We love them anyways. The heart wants what the heart wants. And then we give them that cheesy smile. Or maybe it's a little creepy and they call the cops. Careful with the smile. But before I get to my list of 7 guilty pleasure reads, I'm going to share one piece of advice that I've learned. Stop trying to convince people how good your guilty pleasure books are. I don't mean you have to pretend that you don't like them. And I'm not saying you shouldn't recommend these books to anyone anymore. I'm simply saying we need to acknowledge a truth here. We like books for reasons that can't always be explained. We love them despite their issues. Some books are analytically, statistically, measurably trash, and we still like them. So when we share them with others, either they're going to fall in love with the books too, or they will not understand us at all. It's one or the other. Don't bother advocating for the merits of these books, because those people who don't like them, they're just not going to get it. You don't really get it either. You just like them. So, except some people won't be on board. Don't debate with them. Just share the books you love and let people think what they think. You know, this actually happened recently with the number 1 guilty pleasure on my list with a good friend of mine. I speak from experience, and I'll reference that specific experience later in the episode. But we got to work our way up to that point in the list. So, as always, we're going to start at the bottom. My 7th guilty pleasure. And then we'll get to number 1 when we get there. But number 7 is The Sword of Truth series by Terry Goodkind. I read this series many years ago now, and honestly, I'd like to read it again. Since engaging with the various science fiction and fantasy fandoms, I've learned that is not a popular opinion. Some people really don't like The Sword of Truth for 2 primary reasons. A, it does get pretty sadistic and dark as you move through the series. I mean, like a really dark fantasy twist on 50 Shades of Grey. Torture style. Ooh. And B, the author was a piece of work. Terry Goodkind spoke very critically of fantasy fiction fans. He described his own work as more a philosophical treatise on the human condition. He was very full of himself in that regard, and he was quite demeaning of any comparison to other fantasy authors. Wheel of Time fans, in particular, have an issue with Terry Goodkind. He rather disparaged Robert Jordan when Goodkind was accused by the fandom of borrowing ideas from Jordan's The Wheel of Time. He's like, I would never borrow from such fantasy trash. Okay, I'm paraphrasing, but regardless, I rather liked the books. I've only read the core of the series, which is books 1 through 12. They go a little off the rails toward the end of that, but especially in the earlier books, this series was great for me. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but when things got a little dark or really dark, I don't know, it was kind of working. Even the torture and bondage stuff. I mean, that stuff gets a little icky, but I was still having a good time. So, yeah, guilty pleasure material. And I wouldn't mind at all rereading this series. Though I doubt I'd ever get to the additional 15 books that Terry Goodkind wrote that I've kind of heard are more of a money grab. You know, they were willing to write more checks, so he found a way to write more books. The series was done after 12. But Goodkind, he just kept pumping them out all the way up until months before he died in 2020. The last book came out. Oh well. Ironically, that was just before we started Fantasy for the Ages, and I was still a fan at that point of the Sword of Truth series. And then I started stepping back as the fans came at me, but I'm saying now, no. Grow up, Jim. Guilty pleasure. I like the Sword of Truth. Number 6 on this list is Dragonlance. Particularly the first trilogy, the Dragonlance Chronicles, and the second trilogy, The Twins, both written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. There's so much fantasy fiction that really is better than Dragonlance. Even if we limit the spectrum of fantasy we're comparing it to just to sword and sorcery fantasy, yeah, Dragonlance is still just, well, qualitatively, it's okay. It's not great fantasy. And let's remember, the Dragonlance franchise, it got its start specifically as a means to promote and sell more of the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. The planet Krynn, where all of Dragonlance is focused, is the same setting that Dungeons & Dragons was building upon. It was an intentional means to get people more excited about D&D, and it worked. A little backdrop and explaining why I don't care. I started playing Dungeons & Dragons in 1980. It had only really hit its stride with wide publication in 1977. By 1980, my friends, all the kids I knew, all the kids I hung out with were all playing Dungeons & Dragons. Translate that as smart, nerdy kids. That's the friends I knew. But we were all doing it. We're talking about what level cleric you have now and how is your barbarian doing and all this stuff. So I'd be at Dungeons & Dragons for about 4 years when Dragons of Autumn Twilight hits the bookstores, along with new D&D modules that we could get into and explore for gaming. So when I read that initial Dragonlance trilogy, there's all sorts of middle school nostalgia piling back up for me. Even through middle school and high school, I'm playing Dungeons & Dragons, and it's the shining light in my experience, because a lot of middle school and high school was not all that grand for me. I had to put up with the jocks. I had to put up with bullying. I wasn't necessarily the cool kid. But D&D, man, that was a safe haven. That was a place where even some of the jocks came and let me DM them in some games. We actually had a good time together exploring this role-playing game. And the books, they're all tied right into it. I even continued playing Dungeons & Dragons into college. Just the first year, a little bit of the second year, and then, by then I was engaged to my wife, and I had better things to do. Sorry. I didn't do anything else with D&D until I introduced it to my son many years later, and he's still playing. But after Dragonlance Chronicles, we moved into Dragonlance Legends. Now, this trilogy focuses on two of the best characters from Chronicles, the brothers Raistlin and Caramon. That story that's told over this trilogy, I think, is far superior to the original Chronicles. I love it even more. And so the first trilogy, the second trilogy, both of them are like, I don't care that there's other fantasy that's better. They're just so enjoyable. They are a comfort for me to dip my toes back into. And I've read them many times. Now there are well over 100, there's almost 200, I think, Dragonlance novels out there, written by many different authors. The latest to appear, after about an 11-year gap between any new content, Weiss and Hickman came back to write a new trilogy. There are 2 books out already, and the final book is supposed to come out next month. Dragonlance, still alive and well, people. I haven't read that final trilogy. In fact, there's a lot of those other books I have not touched, but I'd kind of like to. Guilty pleasure. Number 5 is the Xanth series by Piers Anthony. First published in 1977, there are now 47 books in the Xanth series, and a 48th is forthcoming. I've only read the first 9. About all that existed when I found the series and read through them. Then I'm out of books. I moved on to other fantasy things, and I never looked back. Years later, while doing this show, I discovered Piers Anthony kept writing this series, and like I said, there's already 47 books now. That's a lot of them that I have not read. Anthony did not only do Xanth, he's an accomplished fantasy author with a few other works out there too that are very successful. Most would agree his Xanth series is not his strongest writing, but it might be his most addictive. The books are rather silly, and they lean into it for good fantasy fun. Xanth is a fantastical world that is a parallel world to Earth, and there is even ways you can travel back and forth between the two. All the creatures in Xanth represent the typical fairy creatures that we know and love if we're fantasy fans. But there's also humans. And the humans, they all have some magical ability. It comes in many different shapes and forms, and that lends itself to the fun of the novels. Also, these books lean heavily into puns. There seems to be some magic behind wordplay, as Piers Anthony chooses to use it in Xanth. It's very grown-worthy. Plays nicely to the dad joke nature in me. Now, what some don't appreciate about Xanth and why it can show up on the guilty pleasure list is some of the books are a little childish, perhaps, but then some of it goes a little misogynistic, some would say. Really demeaning of women. As a young man, honestly, I found these books very entertaining. I didn't have any issues with what I was seeing. I could say some women may not feel the same way, and there might be some truth to the criticism. Regardless, I enjoyed the books, and I would consider reading more of them at some point, even revisiting the ones I'd already read, if I could find the time in the midst of all the other books I still want to get to. I do want to note, when it comes to misogyny, Piers Anthony is very strong in denying that there's any aspect of that in the books. It's just good fun, he's saying, and people are reading into it too much, seeing what they want to see, and coming at him. And he says it's not deserved. Stop taking it so seriously. I tend to lean with Piers Anthony here. I'm a fan. I also appreciate how Anthony demonstrates a lot of creativity in the writing of these books, some skill as a storyteller, and he creates some characters you actually do enjoy and come to care about. There's plenty to enjoy with Xanth. Now, number 4 on my list is a little more popular of a series. Some of you might be surprised I put it as a guilty pleasure, and that's the Shannara series by Terry Brooks. This series is one of my absolute favorites, with over 30 books in publication, starting again back in 1977, and the series ran through 2020. I've read all of them. And Brooks, while he finished the series in 2020, he stepped back from that a little and he started writing Shannara books again. He's writing a series called The Druids of Shannara now, and book 1, Galfil, is supposed to drop in March of 2025. I'm looking forward to reading it. Shannara is classic high fantasy. And I've read, like I said, every book that's out there, even some of the short stories that came with it. If Shannara is attached to it, I've consumed it. And I can tell you, there's nothing wrong with Shannara. The criticism of the series that some people feel it doesn't progress enough, it's too repetitive, a little too one note. I'm like, did they read the same books I did? Brooks is accused of running out of ideas and repeating plot lines, having too little originality as he gets further and further into the series. I'm like, yeah, there's some circularity in the story as we pass through literal centuries. Hey, what has come once will come again. It's intentional. Brooks is doing this very much on purpose, but at the same time, he's masterfully progressing the political setting, the way magic works in the world, the rise of technology and how it impacts society. Everything shifts, and he's brilliant with the way he wrote this series and woefully underappreciated by some fantasy snobs. I'm just going to say it. Yep. His overall plot, it's excellent. There's through points that carry all the way through, even in the midst of individually capsulized stories that come in trilogies and quartets all the way through. I make no apologies. I'm a Shannara fan, and I'm glad to see there are new books coming out. Number 3, my third guilty pleasure, Marvel Comics. I actually have a Marvel Universe subscription that I pay for every year so that I can return to the comics I love from time to time without any extra cost. I've read through entire runs, starting back in the 1960s and moving all the way towards modern day, such as the X-Men, all the various X-Men lines. Now, the most new stuff I haven't read, but up through the 2015, I'd gotten all the way through with all that X-Men stuff. The Incredible Hulk. And again, they splinter off into different lines, and I've read them all. Now I'm working on the Avengers. There's so many different breakoffs from the Avengers. This will take me till I die, probably. But I enjoy it. I don't spend a lot of time. I'm not continuously reading Marvel comics. But every time I do, I'm quite engaged. I tend to value the era of the 80s and the 90s in Marvel Comics more than the stuff that came before. And as we get past the 90s further and further, I start to feel less and less like they're writing for me. The audience has shifted. The cultural narrative that they're weaving into Marvel Comics is not as much what I'm comfortable with, but I still read them. And I still find things I can value. I keep coming back and I keep paying my annual fee. Marvel Comics feature considerable artistic skill, creative storylines, and excellent vocabulary. As a former elementary school teacher, I had no issue with students reading comics in school. Whatever got them interested in reading worked for me, and the level of vocabulary was higher than the typical book that these kids would be picking up. So parents often underappreciated that. I'm like, no, don't tell them stop reading comics. That's not real books. Read the comics. It's good for you. And if they're interested, I'm like, yeah, whatever will get people reading. So yes, people, I still read comics and I enjoy them. Number 2, second most significant guilty pleasure is The Dresden Files by Jim Butcher. Zach and I have had our issues and discussions with this series. It's one of my favorite. Starting with Stormfront in 2000, Butcher has been delivering some exceptional, the standard of urban fantasy fiction for years now. His most recent novel in the series came out in 2020. So yeah, 20 years of writing books in this series already, and there's more to come. He also has published plenty of short stories and novellas that accompany the core 17 books of the series. People, including Zach, have issues with Butcher's main character, Harry Dresden, and his backwards, old-fashioned perspective on women. I'm not going to justify it. Harry is who he is. But from book 1, I never had an issue with it. Perhaps my views are naturally more old-fashioned as well. Primarily, though, I sensed Jim Butcher was writing Harry simply as someone who had a backward, outdated perspective on women. He is not trying to be demeaning. He is not looking down on women. He venerates women. He wants to protect the weaker sex. It's an old-fashioned mode, but it's just who he is. And as the series progresses, he grows better in this regard. He learns stuff and starts to look at women differently. Now, yes, he also looks at women, objectifying them at times. He definitely has an eye for the physical form, the attractive features of a woman. Most men do. Let's not pretend they don't. So he's just a guy being a guy. And yet he overcomes some of those things. We get to see what's in his head, but he doesn't act on those things most of the time. And that's the best we can hope for men, to be honest. Guys who say, oh yeah, I never look at those parts of a woman. Oh, get out of here. You lying through your teeth. Now, people who think Butcher demeans women in this series, they have not read the series. Women are strong and powerful characters in the Dresden Files. There's almost a 50-50 balance of powerful women characters against powerful men. And the interesting characters that come out of the female side of things is just amazing. Molly Carpenter, Queen Mab, Murphy. I mean, Guard. There's so many. And it makes the whole story fascinating. Some criticize the series in another way. They complain, and my son was one of these, that the books really kind of start slow. They don't bring much to the table. It takes a while for the series to really develop and draw your interest. And that's where it fits my guilty pleasure profile. I thoroughly enjoyed it from book 1. But other people, okay, it's not till book 3 that it starts to get a little better. And there's some, it's not till book 6, 7, 8, 12 that they're finally invested. I can't explain that. I don't understand. It's my jam, and I felt Jim Butcher got me, or I got him, and his humor just clicked. So I love it. Can't justify it, won't talk anyone into it, but I do recommend the Dresden Files. But my number 1, the series that inspired this episode, is Mark Tufo's Zombie Fallout. This is my ultimate guilty pleasure series, and unabashedly, I will tell you, this writing is not something that's going to win awards. The humor is repetitive and sometimes juvenile. And yeah, it's zombie apocalypse literature. It is definitely not mainstream. Friend of the show, good friend of mine, Eric Hahn, tried the series because I enjoy it so much and talked about how much I loved it. And he barely made it through the first book. He's like, okay, I'm going to try the second book because, you know, you keep saying it gets better. And yeah, he DNF'd partway through the second book. He just couldn't get past the issues that he saw with the writing, and he's an author, so he's judging with that filter. His perspective on these characters that were so caricature, so stereotypical. The sarcastic, infantile humor of some of the primary characters. And even though he started to see the narrative going some interesting ways, some elements of the conflict starting to take more shape as he was kind of at his limit, you know, he's like, okay, I can see maybe it's going to do something, but the weaknesses, the things I can't stand are too much. I'm done. Okay, fair enough. But for me, the series cracks me up, and I've read every book that's out there now, over 21 books. It's a comfort zone series. I don't have to work very hard to absorb it, to digest what I'm reading. I know what I'm going to get. It is very predictable in its humor, in its pacing, and I can just laugh and enjoy the story, even as characters struggle through the challenges of a world of zombies and so much more that's out to get them. Now, again, Eric, he hates this series. I don't think it's too harsh to say that, yet I love it. So either it works for you or it doesn't. I have interacted with some of you out here, our subscribers, who also love the Zombie Fallout series and appreciate that I've lifted it up. And others think it's complete trash. That's just how things are. And again, it's what makes it a guilty pleasure. There's no explaining why I value zombie Fallout to someone, when someone else can point out its significant flaws and why they dislike it. My love for it is not quantifiable. It just is. And that's okay. That's the point of this episode, people. Love what you love, and that's all right. But don't bludgeon other people over the head with it, saying, you must love it too. No, they don't. Because sometimes it's just not going to happen. Sometimes you'll love something, and others will not, and let it be. All right, so that's what I have for you today. You got to see a little bit of my inner thoughts. I've revealed some things I've not shared publicly before about my guilty pleasures. How about you? Which of these books on here do you agree with me? And which of them are just absolutely shock you? How about what are your guilty pleasure reads? Which are the ones that others can't understand how you can enjoy them so much? Put them down in the comment box. Let's dialogue a little bit about guilty pleasures. Just let it all out, people, and I will not judge you. Others might, but you're safe with me. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.